more of Econ, and I am hoping that the video produces okay this week. Last week, of course, about half of it was lost to the video that was lost to time, and I might split this one up in terms of recording just to make sure I've got a good handle on things. The fourth lesson, fourth unit in economics is called A Brief Economic History of the United States. And yes, we're going to be talking about a lot of things that are going to make you think that you are in a standard U.S. history class, but we're going to be looking at American economic history. And you will find that the America that we see today from an economic standpoint was not always the case. We'll also try to reconcile how the economy agrees with not only the Constitution, what we've written down, but with our own set of what we call American values. The colonial period was predated, of course, by the desire for Europe to colonize. Why were they so keen on colonizing? Well, there had developed an appetite in Europe for goods from Asia, spices and other imports. And as you can see from this map here, these are some of the overland trade routes that developed between Europe and Asia. And if you know the scale of the world and the available technology in the 15th century, this was a brutal journey. It was dangerous, it was costly, it took forever. It could take over a year to go from, say, Europe to Asia, pick up stuff, trade, and then come on back. So there was enough to develop the appetite, but by gosh, it was hard to get. So they began looking for a water route to Asia. The idea being if you sailed along far enough in the Atlantic, you'd eventually sneak up on Asia. Well, of course, we know there's this great big continent called North and South America that's in your way. That's where the colonialism began, and naval exploration for that matter. And of course, we know that Europe, Spain, Portugal, France, and England primarily became involved in establishing overseas colonies. It was seen the first colonies really had two purposes. Some of them utilized one more than the other. First off, there was the economic aspect. The idea was they found this great continent that was just really sparsely populated by indigenous peoples. They quickly found out that the indigenous peoples did not have as good a weapons as they did, so they came up with the idea, all right, we got all these natural resources here. It's not Asia, but they got a bunch of stuff here. A lot of spices, coconuts, and everything like that. So let's go ahead and come here, take what we want. Let's set up a trade post here and do basically what we want to do. There was also the more altruistic goal of bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ to these indigenous peoples. There were some actual Christians involved in this who actually wanted to do some Jesus-like things and to spread the gospel of Christ. And quite a few people did not see these two motives as mutually exclusive. They could both be done. Of course, when we get to what we call our permanent colonies, the Spanish were the first to settle what we now call the United States of America, primarily in Florida. It was very scattered, but really until the 19th century, the Florida Peninsula was largely under Spanish control. The rest of the mainland of what we now call the United States was colonized by English. We know the Jamestown colony of 1607. That was primarily an economic venture. That was done for tobacco and other goods. Now, the Plymouth colony, Massachusetts, the Pilgrims, 1620, was a largely Puritan settlement, and their goal was not so much an economic venture, but spiritual reasons. Religious liberty, and that longing for religious liberty, coming from some very tumultuous religious times in Europe, also spurred this period of colonization. Now, as more and more colonies were formed and economies began to develop, the main economy was, of course, agriculture. 80% of the colonists were small farmers. In the 13 colonies, you kind of developed three different types of economies. Again, agriculture was the undergirdment of all these economies. But up here in the north, you see in this map, you had the New England colonies, which began to emphasize a lot of just straight up trading, shipbuilding, fishing, small businesses, sawmills, and a little bit later textile mills. Now, the colonies in the deep south had lots of land, a little bit more land available, and with the year-round growing conditions in some cases, this was going to be an agricultural enterprise for the most part. So large agricultural ventures fueled the South, and for the few middle states here, you had a kind of a mix of the two. Now, for most of the colonists, even the smallest of farmers, America had much more opportunity than their homes in Europe. If you lived in inner city London, your options were very, very limited. If you could somehow buy passage on one of these ships that's going to the New World, as they called it, then you could go over there, homestead an acre or two of land, and be far richer, at least in terms of land, than you ever would have in England. Many of them came here as indentured servants. That is to say, they agreed to serve a landowner for a period of time, after which time they would be given their own little small tract of land. Unfortunately, as we all know all too well, there were permanent indentured servants brought to the United States, African and Central American and Caribbean slaves. They became, of course, the foundation of the Southern plantation economy, which was very, very labor dependent. It required, if you ran a sawmill, you could do that with a few people. If you ran a 200-acre cotton farm, you needed more than a few people. And the slaves, as the owners found out, brought a quick supply of cheap, extremely cheap labor. All you had to pay for was, food and housing, obviously. So as that became a working economic model, and it did work, the numbers added up, which is sometimes all you need to claim an economy is a success. Because it worked that well, it became embedded not only into the economy of the southern United States, but, as we well know, the very culture of the South. Now, as technology continued to advance, and that's going to be one thing we continue to go look back on in terms of economic development, is the development of raw technology. It played a major role. By the mid-1700s, and even a little further, most of the seacoast towns were more busy with trade. They had established these ports in the cities and trade with other nations, primarily not just Britain, because we were considered British subjects, but France and Portugal and other nations. That was the big industry in the Northeast in particular. We were starting to move away from agriculture, and the first efforts of what we would call modern-day industry were taking hold. Now, again, the American colonies were part of the British Empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. They had outposts all over the world. In 1763, King George III, after the French and Indian War, which was very costly to the Brits, it occurred in what was then considered the Far West Territories, Michigan, which is now considered not west at all, but yeah, that was the unexplored frontier at the time. French influence from the north was trying to make a pact with the Indians to let the French settle as opposed to the British. The British attacked. Long story short, that 9-year war resulted in an uneasy truce with England as the better, coming out on the better end of the deal. But it also spooked King George III insofar as he wanted to try to avoid this conflict in the future. So in 1763, he simply forbade British colonists from settling on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, this frustrated a lot of the Americans who said, we fought this dadgum war so we could expand and open our lands over here, and now you're telling us we can't. That and the increasing British taxes to pay for that French and Indian War, along with other political restrictions on political organizing among the colonists. Yeah, all that witch's brew kind of settled into the American Revolution. You remember the other elements we talked about in government class, the Boston Tea Party, when London tried to control the tea trade in the colonies. Yeah, the spirit of rebellion, of American Revolution, was fomented primarily by economic reasons. Yes, social reasons, of course, were a big part of it. But it all kind of stemmed from the economy, self-determination, not only in terms of the measure of a man, an individual, but also in terms of this unique economy to continue to thrive without undue British interference. So we know what happened in the Revolution. The first governing document of the United States, our old buddy, the Articles of Confederation. Well, we talked about the shortcomings of that. In its effort to try to minimize federal power, it pretty much gave no federal power to speak of. So it was not really functional in that respect in terms of as a governing document for a country. Also, the United States, the Continental Congress, which raised the Army, they had a lot of debts. They had to pay for this war somehow, and they started off very heavily in debt, did this nation. They began to finance the war by issuing bonds, where wealthy individuals would loan money to the U.S. With the expectation of getting their money back with interest. We also had states undergoing big fiscal crises at the time. The difference between hard money and paper money. Hard money, gold and silver, specie, if you want to call it that, actual tangible wealth, that was in very short supply in the New World at this time, and inflation was raising the price for commodities. In 1786, again a full decade after this government was formed, Daniel Shays led a rebellion of Massachusetts farmers against what they felt was unfair treatment by the creditors to whom they owed money. The farmers marched on the state capitol, demanded relief. The state militia dispersed them, but that began to, of course, fuel fears about more violent revolts. Also, that instability out west, the Indian Territory and whatnot, if you look at it on a map here, that prevented a lot of farmers and others who sold goods from gaining access to one of the best ports in the world, New Orleans. That area was controlled by the French at that time, but of course, for a fee, they would let the English colonists use their ports, which were great. You could put just almost unlimited amounts of stock on these ships that could settle in the New Orleans port. And because of the instability out west, they could not physically gain access to the port of New Orleans. That was a big issue. So what began as a meeting of representatives from 5 states for the purpose of discussing sea trade and interstate commerce, economic issues, it became the Constitutional Convention. And we know all about the document that they ended up adopting. And of course, the economic provisions of the Constitution kind of played along with some of the other provisions that we've talked about in our government class. Again, they wanted to strike a balance of having a government that was powerful enough to be a federal government, but also as unobtrusive as possible in order to maximize individual, and in this case, what we're talking about, economic freedom. The fiscal powers of the government under the Constitution are limited. They are enumerated in some cases, though. Congress has the power to collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to pay the debts to provide for the common defense. We know that. They also have the authority, explicit authority, to borrow money on the credit of the United States. They have the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the Indian tribes. The Congress has the authority to establish laws on bankruptcies, to coin money, to regulate the value of this coin, and to fix standards, weights, and measures, and to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting. If someone's arrested on counterfeiting charges today, those are not state charges. Those are still federal charges. That's purview of the federal government. Section 9 of the Constitution forbade Congress from imposing a direct tax except in proportion to census enumeration. That was the one taxing restriction that was enumerated by the Constitution. It also forbade states from printing their own money and from collecting their own duties. We talked about that in government class. How terrible would it be, or how confusing would it be, to have different currencies in Virginia and North Carolina, particularly for those of us who live along the border here. Even at this early date, slavery was a sore point, a subject of bitter debate. We know about the compromises in the Constitution, 3/5 compromise and things like that, in terms of using slavery as a part of the national head count. But again, the Constitution, as we know, left slavery largely as a state-regulated issue. Politician, not the rapper, Alexander Hamilton, helped to establish what we would call a national economy. He proposed that the United States government assume the debts that had been incurred under the Continental Congress. He proposed that the federal government issue bonds, and the sale of additional bonds provided revenue for government expenditures. The purpose was to show, first up, that this new government could stand by its financial obligations. A second part of his plan involved government assistance in creating what he saw as a burgeoning manufacturing economy. Even at that date, Hamilton quickly envisioned that a 100% or mostly 100% agriculture economy was going by the wayside. He wanted to ban the importation of some items and impose import tariffs on foreign goods. Now, those have been debated throughout American history, but for decades, imports, tariffs, things we charge on goods coming in from other nations, that was, for a long time, the primary source of federal revenue. Congress rejected a lot of it, but they accepted a lot of it too. It was the first, again, effort at creating national, under the United States, economic policy. And finally, and this is something we'll look at here that was juggled about throughout the years, Hamilton proposed the creation of a national bank to handle the government's fiscal affairs, providing loans to commercial customers as well. The initial assets came, of course, from these private investors who bought the bonds we were just talking about. On the basis of its assets, the banks could issue notes, literally notes, that would serve as a national currency. And even today, that dollar bill you're bringing around is still nothing more than a promissory note from the Federal Reserve that this is good for $1 of value. The colonial period saw merchants most often offering credit. The whole concept of credit is a big part of the study of economics. Borrowing money to purchase something, then paying it back at an inflated rate. That's credit. Most of the original credit was shop owners. Let me get a couple things of milk and some bread here, and you put me down for $1 credit, and I'll pay you back. That's credit. Now we get into a national economy where it is banks and central lending institutions that are handling the very idea of credit. Not surprisingly, Thomas Jefferson was a big opponent of this. He opposed Hamilton just about every way politically. He thought the federal bank was unconstitutional insofar as it was not mentioned in the Constitution. So then we're already having that discussion. If it's not in the Constitution, is it unconstitutional? We still ask that of ourselves today. There was lots of early economic instability, as you would expect, a new nation and whatnot. The federal revenues really increased quickly under the new nation, but we're starting an economy, and it's starting under new rules. There were central banks in Europe that handled money on behalf of the crown, the kings and queens. When this government, though, which ostensibly started as a reaction to excessive taxation from England, began taxing people in order to raise money to do things that government does, the people began revolting, just like they had earlier. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania feared that the taxes on their products which made whiskey would hamper sales. They rebelled, and President Washington sent a large federal force, part of the Continental Army, to defuse the rebels. And it was very significant insofar as that established that this government had some teeth behind it, that it would enforce its policies. Now, as much as we talk about government policy here fueling the economy, in this country, government policy is supposed to be simply the way to make the private entrepreneurial spirit as lucrative as possible. At its best, under the intent of this economy, government sets the ground rules, makes sure everyone stays within the rules, then largely stays out of the way as the economy, the free market economy that we talked about so much with Adam Smith, takes root, takes hold. Again, remember, the ideological basis for the Constitution was John Locke and the idea stemming from the Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment, the idea of individual sovereignty, and of course Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. That was the philosophical foundation for not only the country but the economy as well. As we see technology moving, textile mills became the first of the major manufacturing industries, primarily in Massachusetts. As textile mills grew, that increased the demand for cotton. Southern states had plenty of that. And in 1793, an invention came along, here's technology again, which made cotton even more lucrative. The cotton gin made the process of separating the seed from the cotton go from a arduous, labor-intensive hand exercise to something that was machinated, and it dramatically increased the productivity of workers. Now, instead of having 50 people working the separation, hand threshing of the cotton, now you just dump it into a machine, get a couple of people to turn the crank, and those other 48 people can be doing something else. In a 1 decade period, cotton exports went from 500,000 pounds to 20 million pounds, just like that. Even in this age of relatively slow growth, that is a skyrocketing amount. Southern plantation owners, because now there's a market for more cotton, they can make more cotton. Well, that means we need more labor now, even if you have a labor-saving device like the cotton gin. And of course, when we say labor in the Old South, we mean slave labor. And again, that social reliance on the industry that crops up around the idea of slavery became even stronger. The more the South economically relied on slaves for cheap labor, the more that reliance became ingrained into the social fabric. Other inventions that helped speed things up. The steamboat in 1807 made goods move 3 times as fast. The Erie Canal in New York was built by not the federal government, but the state of New York. The idea was to open up markets where they go west over here, you see, to the Great Lakes, where they could get to Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, some of these far western cities that are developing and need goods. Also, it intersected here with the Hudson River, and if you go south on the Hudson, that ends in New York City. The Erie Canal, as much as anything else, allowed New York City to become the chief financial center of this country. So, as the nation began to grow, nothing helped growth just like straight up buying a whole bunch of land, which is what we did in 1803 with this right here, the Louisiana Purchase. For $15 million, still a bargain even by that time standpoints, when you look at the amount of land. Again, in terms of assets, land was one of the most valuable commodities to have at this point in history. Always has been. Less so today. Today, more wealth lies in the ability to transfer and process information and data. That's a great source of wealth today, but land for the longest time was, that in gold was really your number one source of what everyone recognized as wealth. So now this great resource that the government had, they got now twice as much of it. So for about, the next couple of decades into the early 1810s, as the U.S. began settling this formerly disputed country, now they owned the city of New Orleans, so that was less of an issue. But what was still an issue was British involvement in a lot of these affairs out west. Lots of insecurity created on the frontier there by British outposts and many American ships leaving for Britain. were accosted by British government. Anyway, a lot of things added up to the War of 1812. Won't get into an awful lot of that, but there was an embargo act that President Jefferson put in to try to punish England. Anyway, the War of 1812, we're not going to get into it. It was fought. We won, so to speak, insofar as we ended completely British influence in what's now the United States, but it was costly. The U.S. had to borrow a whole lot of money to pay for that war, and again, that led to differing ideas. The Bank of the United States, remember the one that was created under Alexander Hamilton? Its 20-year lease ran out in 1811, and there was questions about whether, again, it was constitutional, but also, do we need to continue this? And of course, when the war started, they knew that they needed a bank as a central borrowing mechanism to pay for all this fun stuff. Also, remember our old friend credit. The government sold a lot of this property they obtained in the Louisiana Purchase on credit. It's a great idea if you say, boy, I sold this property here to John Doe over here, and I sold it for $100,000. Well, right now, you don't have $100,000. John Doe hasn't paid you that back yet, so that's credit. That is a credit asset. And if something happens to John Doe, you're out of your $100,000. Now, you got the land again, but that money, that liquid currency you were counting on, you don't have. The U.S. government got into a lot of trouble by taking credit out on this new land that they had acquired. And when lots of people defaulted on paying the money back, the U.S. was left holding the bag. You will notice a common theme as we talk about recessions, depressions, panics. We can argue about the esoteric differences of each of them, but a lot of them are fueled by bad credit. And by people, in this case the United States, getting a little greedy and offering credit to someone who probably is not going to be able to pay it back, just so you can have the short-term satisfaction and, of course, the upfront payments from having sold said assets. You'll see that cropping up a lot here. Britain and France continue to be our top trading partners for a long time. In 1824, a landmark case happened in terms of U.S. economic authority. Gibbons versus Ogden gave a broad interpretation of the right of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. As you'll see here in this modernized version of the ruling, the decision struck down a steamboat monopoly granted by the state of New York that affected travel from New York to New Jersey. The decision effectively created a national U.S. economy based on free trade and guided only by Congress instead of being hindered by a patchwork of conflicting state regulations. So basically, Gibbons versus Ogden established the supremacy of the federal government in terms of interstate commerce. This was a big decision even today. Variations of the Commerce Clause were used to argue successfully in favor of the constitutionality of Obamacare just a few years ago. It's not history, it's real. It happens now. Andrew Jackson was a big figure in the development of the U.S. economy. Remember our old friend, the Bank of the United States? Well, its 20-year lease was up during the middle of Jackson's term. Right after the end of his first term, he was running for re-election, and Republicans wanted to make it a campaign issue that Jackson hated the bank. He thought Americans should use the gold and silver standard, the so-called hard money, the specie. Now, Jackson failed to appreciate the stabilizing effects that the bank could have, but he was correct in that the bank was using its power to wield a whole lot of influence. Where you've got money, you're going to have people attempting to get it. And they will do almost anything to get it. That's greed. They will play outside the rules to get it. That's the danger of having government too intermixed with the economy. However, from a practical standpoint, there was a stabilizing effect to the economy that the bank had. It made sure that things didn't get too far out of whack. Jackson weakened the bank, that is, during his second term, 1832. He removed all the federal funds from the bank and just made it a holding institution. The bank's charter expired in 1836. Meantime, the federal government was operating pretty good because trade was good. Tariff collections gave them actually a surplus, and some of the people were paying back the loans that they took out, the credit they were extended to buy some of those Western properties. The month later, the Jackson administration changed all that. They said, if you're going to buy land from us, you're going to pay in hard cash. Remember that gold and silver? So the federal government then withdrew their money from state banks. And then the state banks had less of the so-called hard money to back up the paper currency. You add it all up. Again, we're not going to get too deep in the weeds on this. You add it all up and you get what was called the Panic of 1837. That coupled with some turmoil overseas. And again, a lot of this was the extension of bad credit and a loss of faith. You would think faith had no role in the economy, but it does. If you trust that your investments are going to be protected and sound, you're going to behave differently than if you do not have trust. Trust is sometimes, I think, overlooked in terms of its economic importance. It's very crucial. As a result, at one point, a third of Americans did not have work to speak of. And of course, there were no federal programs at that time to help them out. We were in trouble. Now, technology to the rescue. Sort of. It would be simplistic to say the invention of the reaper, the telegraph, and the discovery of gold in California pulled us out of these doldrums, but it played a major, major role. The federal government, as a result, would not assume a major role in the nation's banking, that is, the extension of credit, for many, many years. Congress created what they called an independent treasury, a system of depositories that where the U.S. would invest their money. And of course, as we'll find out here in a second, the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, a series of banks that direct U.S. lending. Of course, the big event after that was the Civil War. The economic impact of the Civil War cannot be overstated. Again, it was costly in terms of more than just the 600,000 lives on both sides we lost. It cost a lot of money for the United States and the Confederacy to operate that war. For the South, it was devastating. The entire railroad infrastructure of the South was destroyed. Railroads had become the way that goods were moved overland. Nothing competed with them. The South produced $2 billion of cotton a year before the war. It took them 20 years to get back to that level. The region's economy did not really move beyond an agrarian base until 1950. And even then, you can say today with a straight face that the American South has not fully economically recovered from the Civil War. That's how far-reaching the impact was. Now, the North financed its war effort through increased taxes and tariffs. Not all of them were very popular. But after the war ended, something continued that had really begun before the war, this entire economic transformation of mainly the northern states. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed shortly after the Civil War, giving people a means for overland transport of goods and people, literally from coast to coast. Land Grant Act of 1869 set up state agricultural and mechanical colleges. Homestead Act encouraged, again, more prospecting, making land settling and farming out in the Great Plains. The Civil War, like most wars do, increased the size, scope, and power of the federal government and the activity after the war. All of these programs, investments, that also increased the size, scope, and power of the federal government, and we haven't stopped since. We've talked about this before. The America's natural resources throughout all this, just kind of as an aside, played a big role in all this. We didn't have to import much out of necessity. It was mostly out of things we wanted to import just because we liked them and whatever. Abundant land meant we had a whole lot of iron, coal, oil, which fed this growth. We didn't have to import really anything. that we didn't just want. I mean, in terms of needs, there was very little in that. This led to some of the American industries of the time becoming very, very big. We talked about the robber barons last week. These great captains of industry who created great companies, great business ventures out of this. Carnegie and steel, Rockefeller and oil. Again, so many of the great monopolies of the time, Vanderbilt with the railroads, that they came to be very dominant forces, monopolistic forces in some cases. What do we say about free markets? They cannot abide a monopoly. That's where you would want a government to step in. And for most of the latter 2 centuries of the 2 decades of the 19th century, the government largely had a hands-off approach. So some of these incredibly large businesses, Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel, became just so big that they began getting the reputation of pulling the purse strings of the government. We also had the first major business come up that was not in the business of producing goods. J.P. Morgan, a banker, built a large empire based on investment capitalism. He recognized ventures that would be profitable to invest in. And so instead of producing widgets or whatever, he made money by investing in successful business ventures and became incredibly rich. J.P. Morgan Chase Bank is still in operation today. And it was the first major U.S. industry that did not produce anything. It was a banking, part of the banking industry, and grew to the point where he was the richest man on earth at one point. Again, back to technology. At this time, refrigerated rail cars began making it viable to transport more goods safely across the U.S. Electricity created a whole new economic realm of possibilities. And as we continued in, we start to see the government begin to get involved in what's called trusts, monopolies. These businesses, entities, not even a singular business sometimes a cabal of a few businesses that get together and decide we are going to control the steel industry in America, for instance. The Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 was the first step really towards guiding the actions and powers of these companies along really ethical lines. If you became a monopolistic, we were going to break up the trust, the term came to be told. Under President Teddy Roosevelt, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 directly followed the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, where he talked about the sausage-making industry, and not in a good way. The term seeing how the sausage is made is popular even today in terms of what the Hormel and Armour and the sausage meatpacking industry was allowing before 1906 and after. Anyway, the first big Supreme Court judicial interaction into breaking up monopolies came in 1911 with the verdict against Standard Oil, Rockefeller, out of New Jersey. They were very effective in limiting corporate power. Again, to wrap this little bit up here, regulating businesses to the point where consumers are protected and that free markets exist without unduly depressing businesses and hampering entrepreneurism and new ideas. That is the delicate balance the U.S. government is supposed to play with the U.S. economy. That is the delicate balance that the Constitution is supposed to weigh in terms of individual rights and collective rights. Ostensibly, we have the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. There are collective things, though, that have to be considered in that. Which is superior? It is very important for the government to not get in the way of business development. But also, it is important for government to step in at some point when businesses become unethical or create monopolies or create anti-competitive environments. That balancing act is the fruit of much debate, and then and today, and we will always debate it. And again, thank God we can debate it, because the day we can't, We're not free. Just a couple of quick notes here. As all this was going on, the United States, as policy was changing its monetary policy just left and right. Sometimes we would back the so-called hard money, the gold and silver, other times printing and circulating millions of dollars. The ink used to make the new promissory notes was green, so this new paper money began to be called greenbacks. It caused a little bit of inflation, but it also enabled more flexible economic growth because, again, your rank-and-file person didn't have gold or silver on them. Promissory notes, these greenbacks, helped them to purchase items. Following the Civil War, the greenbacks became much more popular. Again, 1873, 1893, two more panics, again, mostly caused by the two things which usually cause these panics: bad credit being extended and risky speculation. Happens all the time. The Great Panic of 1907 included that, along with some foreign influence. Again, I'm not going to quiz you too much on the cause, but I will say our old friends J.P. Morgan, the financiers, helped organize a group of bankers who invested money in the stock market to help end the Panic of 1907. So even the so-called robber barons who controlled so much money and are portrayed as the evil guys, yeah, they were concerned about the economy because they got to work in it too. They don't want the economy to collapse. This concern, though, after J.P. Morgan was able to do this and able to help stabilize the economy, that led indirectly to Congress creating the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Again, banks, the U.S. Bank, your credit is fully backed up by the faith and credit of the United States. You'll see it on your currency. Now, the Great Depression was a slightly different animal in terms of these. It's not a panic because there was not a run on banks, that is to say, people trying to get their money out before the money became worthless. It was, again, a lot of factors that played into it. The over-speculation in the stock market was a big and probably the primary factor, but there were several other things that just happened to converge into the perfect storm to where stock value dropped. Now, we're going to be discussing later what happened when I say stock values dropped, but for now, just know that stock values dropped and created the longest sustained period of economic strife in American history. Now, you will hear people debate to this very day what helped pull us out of the Great Depression. To me, the answer is time. If you leave a capitalistic economy alone, eventually it will recover. The nature of a capitalistic economy, a free market-based economy, is that there are going to be valleys. There's going to be rises and falls. The boom or bust cycle, this is called. And it's going to happen. Speculate, over-speculate, you withdraw, you get your stuff together, you get your feet back under you, and then you invest again. There's success, there's more success, then, a little bit too much. You try to make the valleys not as low and less frequent, because they're going to come. It's going to happen in a capitalistic economy. You try to avoid the Great Depression, the Great Recession, as we'll see later. What pulled us out of the Great Depression? I'd say time, but people argue that FDR, President Roosevelt's policies, direct government involvement in the economy, direct government oversight of the economy, played a role. Others say our participation in World War II and the military-industrial demand that was created there did it. Both of them did it. I think World War II had a little bit more lasting effect. But again, the FDR programs were significant historically in that they established to a lot of people that, yes, government has a role, a direct role in the economy, more direct than some people, like me, believe. But it did help establish that. Wrapping this up, over the past few decades, the government, after the end of World War II, the United States was unquestionably the world's economic power, the largest GDP. Even the Soviet Union, with whom we had the Cold War, military feuding and whatnot, social feuding as well. Even the economic situation in Russia, just from a pure size standpoint. They could not uh, compete with the United States, and eventually, capitalism won. We ground them out. We have limitless resources. We have limitless spirit of entrepreneurship. And if you try to get into an economic war with a nation as powerful as the U.S., with as vast resources as the U.S., and with the spirit of capitalism, we're going to win. Keep that in mind. We In the 1970s, when I was growing up, we learned about the concept of inflation. That is to say, the increasing value of commodities and the decreasing value of the dollar. What you spend $1 for today, tomorrow only buys 80 cents worth of stuff because the dollar is not as valuable. That's inflation. We also learned about, again, natural resources. At that point, we had become an importer of oil from Middle Eastern nations. When the OPEC, the Middle Eastern Oil Cartel, turned off the spigot to us, we found out how much we were dependent on foreign oil, and we reverted in many ways back to energy independence. And really today, we don't have to import a drop of oil. We can produce enough, particularly with natural gas now. Yeah, we're in very good shape in that respect. Ronald Reagan was the first president in several decades to look at government as the problem as opposed to the solution. Under Reagan, there were lots of government cutbacks and regulations of the economy, but spending still went up. Now, yes, there was a Democratic Congress in place, but Reagan was also to blame for that too because he increased defense spending. If you're going to cut taxes, you don't cut spending, you're not doing any good. It's like bailing water out of a boat by dumping it, taking it from one end, putting it in the other. Supply side economics certainly has its merits. It has its roots in Adam Smith. Arthur Laffer was the architect of this. His theory is that lower taxes give people the incentive to work harder, to save and invest more, which in turn stimulates economic growth. There's lots of truth in that. Supply-side economics, but eventually, again, because Reagan and Congress kept spending a lot, the federal deficit kept growing. During the 1990s, the dark side of deregulation came to bite us because one of the things that President Reagan deregulated was savings and loans institutions. Again, bad loans, toxic debt. That was a phrase we heard a lot a few years ago here. Created the S&L buyout because the S&Ls quickly went insolvent. Soon they had fewer rules and they were taking more chances, and all of a sudden the rug was pulled out in front of them. $100 billion it cost the American taxpayer to bail out the savings and loans. And again, with it, the loss of a lot of trust. There were one business here in Danville, Melvin Jones's business here, savings and loan, collapsed, and a lot of people, some people I know, lost a lot of money in that. Since then, we had the dot-com boom in the mid to late 1990s. Again, it's kind of a sort of a house of cards. It was built largely on speculation, but during those years, we increased revenues to the point where the federal government, shocker of shockers, for 2 years in the late 90s, actually ran out of surplus. Wow. We'll talk about that more a little bit later when we discuss government revenues. The 9/11 attacks certainly had an economic slowdown, created an economic slowdown, and of course boosted military spending. And of course the recession of '07. We're still writing the history on that one, which came in your guys' lifetimes. You were small, but it was significant. Stock market value dropped overnight. And as we do the post-mortem on that, it's becoming increasingly apparent that a big part of it was toxic debt. Government had taken away a lot of the restrictions on home ownership. As a matter of fact, government policy, again in the name of social justice, began requiring banks and other lenders to lend to more people who probably couldn't pay it back. So what happens? A lot of them didn't pay it back. A lot of lending institutions became stuck with a whole lot of what's called toxic debt. That is to say, this person owes me X number of dollars. Ain't no way in heck or hell he's going to pay it, but he owes it to me, so that's an asset. But not really. If you're not going to get the money back, it's a toxic asset. When you combined all that with several other factors, most assuredly, it created a major loss in stock market value. The Obama years saw us very slowly recovering from that. And really under President Trump, we had been doing very well for 3 years after that, recovering most of the gains and then some. And then, of course, what we're going through right now, the pandemic. U.S. economic history is complicated. It's also not static. We are living through history right now. Part of the history of this pandemic, when we read about it 10, 30, 40 years from now, I won't be reading about it 40 years from now, but you will. Part of the history of this will be the economic impact it had. So we're not studying the past here when we study economics, even though we've been talking about past events today. We're studying the now. Hopefully you can find some commonalities in what we've talked about here that will frame your modern day understanding of an economy. What makes it work? What makes it not work? What causes it to grind to a halt? Think about some of these things. We'll talk about them in class on Monday. Till then, stay warm. Have a great weekend, everybody.